Before 1974, cognitive science treated human memory like a linear plumbing system. Sensory input flowed into a temporary holding tank, where it either quickly decayed or was pushed forward into long-term storage. This diagram outlines the 1968 Atkinson-Shiffrin multi-store model. Its rigid central block framed temporary memory as a passive waiting room. In 1974, Baddeley and Hitch discarded it, arguing temporary storage requires an active workspace, a multi-component system for continuous processing. The concept of an active mental present has deep roots. In 1890, psychologist William James defined primary memory to describe information currently held in conscious thought, distinguishing it from the vault of past experiences. To understand modern cognitive science, we need to examine the exact behavioral data that Baddeley and Hitch used to map this invisible cognitive system from the ground up. The foundational tool for mapping this architecture is the dual task interference paradigm, a behavioral test that measures the strict limits of our cognitive resources. If you ask a subject to memorize a sequence of numbers and simultaneously ask them to read unrelated words aloud, their performance rapidly deteriorates. The homogeneous data types are competing for the exact same cognitive resource pool. But if you change the test parameters, asking the subject to remember a sequence of numbers while tracking a moving visual target on a screen, the subjects process both data streams simultaneously with almost zero performance penalty. This graph illustrates the phenomenon. Single-format tasks cause a steep decline in accuracy, while multi-format performance remains stable. This mathematical divergence proves that temporary memory cannot be a single unitary tank. It must be divided into separate, domain-specific resource pools. This brings us to the first distinct module of Baddeley's architecture, the phonological loop, handling speech and auditory data. Empirical testing required dividing this into two subcomponents, a passive phonological store and an active articulatory rehearsal mechanism. In 1964, Conrad and Hull demonstrated the acoustic similarity effect. They found that letters with rhyming sounds are harder to recall than non-rhyming ones because the acoustic overlap prevents the store from cleanly isolating discrete units. Further research established the word length effect. Subjects remember fewer multisyllable words than short words because memory span is strictly limited by the physical time it takes to silently, subvocally repeat them. To verify this internal repetition process, researchers use a diagnostic technique called articulatory suppression. By forcing subjects to repeatedly say an irrelevant phrase aloud, like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, the test actively blocks their ability to subvocally rehearse the target data. Occupying the rehearsal mechanism causes the target memory traces to rapidly degrade. This proves the passive phonological store operates with a strict capacity limit of approximately 2 seconds before data vanishes entirely. Data regarding visual and spatial memory required a second independent block, the visuospatial sketchpad. This component was also subdivided, featuring a passive visual cache for static color and shape data and an active inner scribe for tracking spatial sequences. In testing, researchers used tools like this 5x5 matrix to measure visual recall, watching the accuracy degrade over seconds, and compared it against spatial pathing tasks like the Corsi block test. They found that visual recall and spatial tracking suffer independent performance drops when subjects face competing secondary tasks of that exact specific nature. Contemporary neuroimaging aligns with these behavioral findings, confirming that the brain routes visual mapping and spatial tracking through entirely distinct neurological pathways. The human mind does not behave like a camera, passively recording pictures. It actively constructs and maintains internal spatial maps and static visual caches, using distinct, dedicated mechanical processes. With multiple domain-specific slave systems operating at once, the architecture requires a mechanism to coordinate them. Baddeley solved this by introducing the central executive, the overarching control block that manages the data flowing in and out of the slave systems. A strict constraint of this framework is that the central executive has zero storage capacity. It is purely an information processing and routing controller. Its distinct functions can be isolated through behavioral tasks requiring attentional focus, rapid shifting between rules, and division of attention across stimuli. For example, researchers tested the capacity for divided attention by comparing dual task performance in patients with Alzheimer's disease against healthy individuals, identifying severe specific deficits in the executive system's ability to multitask. By anchoring executive controls strictly to measurable attentional processes, Baddeley prevented his model from relying on a homunculus, the unscientific assumption of a tiny, conscious manager living inside the brain making decisions. By 1986, the model was highly functional, but contained a structural gap. If auditory and visual processing occur in strictly isolated loops, how do we experience a unified event? To solve this, Baddeley updated the architecture in the year 2000, adding a fourth component, the episodic buffer. This component acts as a multimodal bridge, capable of pulling in and integrating visual, spatial, and phonological data simultaneously. Crucially, it also links downward, extracting accumulated semantic knowledge from long-term memory and pulling it directly into the active cognitive workspace. This access allows the mind to perform chunking. By binding individual pieces of raw data into meaningful blocks based on prior knowledge, the buffer bypasses the strict 2-second capacity limits of the slave systems. The episodic buffer serves as the necessary assembly mechanism that transforms disconnected sensory inputs into the coherent, continuous experience of conscious reality. This completed 4-component architecture has dominated cognitive science for half a century, providing a highly reliable framework for experimental design. However, modern research centers are increasingly advancing competing homogeneous models, driven by researchers like Cowan and Oberauer. These theorists argue that working memory does not exist as a set of separate, dedicated architectural modules. Instead, they view working memory simply as the temporary, attention-driven activation of specific neural networks that already reside entirely within long-term memory. This sets up a clear dividing line in cognitive psychology, treating the mind as an assembly of distinct domain-specific hardware versus viewing it as a fluid, state-based software system. In clinical and diagnostic practice, separating these functions is inherently difficult. Healthy adults seamlessly combine visual, spatial, and phonological resources to solve intelligence tasks, blurring the lines between isolated components. Whether cognitive scientists ultimately classify working memory as discrete structural modules or an activated neural state, the empirical behavioral limits established over 50 years of dual-task interference testing remain the indispensable benchmark for diagnosing human cognition today.